The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against your chest. The walls echoed the sound of shuffling papers and faint whispers. But all eyes were fixed on the man sitting in the judge's seat. Judge Samuel Gray was known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach. His courtroom wasn't a place for drama or theatrics, yet today, something felt different. Seated at the witness stand was Robert Mitchell, a tall, polished man in his late 40s. His expensive suit and smooth-talking demeanor hinted at wealth and influence. His testimony flowed effortlessly, each word calculated to paint him as the perfect father, the responsible parent fighting for justice. Across the room, his ex-wife, Emily, sat quietly with her lawyer, her eyes occasionally darting toward the door as though expecting something or someone. The case wasn't particularly unusual. A messy custody battle, accusations of neglect, financial disputes. But there was an unspoken tension in the room, as if everyone present could feel that something was about to happen. Judge Gray, ever the skeptic, leaned forward, his sharp gaze piercing through Robert's carefully rehearsed words. "And you're saying," the judge interrupted, his tone calm but firm, "that you have no knowledge of the accusations being made against you? No financial irregularities? No incidents of misconduct?" Robert smiled, his teeth gleaming under the courtroom lights. "That's correct, Your Honor. These allegations are baseless. I have always acted in my daughter's best interests." As the words left his mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned to see a young girl, no older than 9, stepping inside. Her dark brown hair framed a pale, determined face, her eyes wide with both fear and resolve. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest as if it held something precious, something she couldn't afford to lose. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I need to say something." The room erupted in whispers. The bailiff took a step forward, but Judge Gray raised a hand, signaling him to wait. His stern eyes softened, just for a moment, as he addressed the girl. "And who are you, young lady?" he asked, his voice steady. "I'm Lily Mitchell," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "And that's my dad." She pointed at Robert, whose confident smile faltered for the first time. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had no idea Lily would be here. She wasn't supposed to be here. Judge Gray glanced at Emily, then back at the girl. "Lily, this is a courtroom. Do you understand the seriousness of what's happening here?" "Yes, sir," Lily said, nodding. Her small hands trembled as she set her backpack on the floor. "But I have to tell the truth because Daddy is lying." A collective gasp swept through the room. Robert's face turned pale, his composed mask cracking as he muttered something under his breath. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Robert waved him off, his eyes locked on Lily. Judge Gray leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what makes you say that, Lily?" Lily hesitated, her small frame visibly shaking. She looked at her mother, who seemed torn between pride and terror, and then back at the judge. Finally, she reached into her backpack, pulling out a thin stack of papers and a small device, a voice recorder. "This," Lily said, holding the items up, "proves everything. It's what Daddy didn't want anyone to know." The whispers turned into murmurs, the tension in the room now thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Gray motioned for the bailiff to bring the items to him. As the evidence was handed over, Lily added, her voice breaking, "I'm sorry, Daddy, but I can't let you hurt us anymore." Robert stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "Lily, stop this nonsense. Come here right now." His voice was sharp, commanding, but it only made Lily flinch and step closer to the judge's bench. Judge Gray held up a hand. "Mr. Mitchell, sit down. You'll have your chance to respond." Robert reluctantly obeyed, his jaw clenched tightly. The judge glanced at the papers, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the first few lines. Then he picked up the recorder and pressed play. As the first crackling sounds emerged from the device, the room fell into an eerie silence once more. The faint sound of a man's voice could be heard, Robert's voice, saying something that made Emily gasp aloud. Whatever it was enough to make Judge Gray's expression harden. The recording played on, but Lily wasn't done. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what he did, and I know why he doesn't want anyone to find out." The judge looked up, his face as grave as the weight of her words. "Lily, what exactly are you saying?" Lily hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. She looked at her father, then at her mother, before finally turning back to the judge. "I'm saying, Daddy's been lying about everything. And if I tell you what I know, he'll never forgive me." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, the tension suffocating. Judge Gray leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "Lily, you're safe here. No one can hurt you for telling the truth. What is it you want us to know?" Lily took a deep breath, her small shoulders rising and falling as she gathered her courage. "It's about the money, and the nights he said he was working. He wasn't working. He was." Before she could finish, Robert leaped to his feet, his voice booming across the courtroom. "That's enough. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The bailiff moved toward Robert, but the judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. "Mr. Mitchell, sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Lily's eyes widened, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her backpack again, as if it could protect her from what was coming next. The judge turned to her, his voice steady. "Lily, you were saying—" But before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see a new figure entering the courtroom, someone who looked just as determined as Lily, but carried an air of authority. And with that, the already explosive trial took an even darker turn, leaving everyone wondering what secrets were about to unravel. The new figure that entered the courtroom was a woman, tall and composed, with an air of authority that commanded attention. Her dark suit and confident stride suggested she wasn't here by accident. In her hand, she carried a briefcase, and her sharp eyes immediately sought out Judge Gray. "Your Honor," she said firmly, stepping forward. "My name is Detective Sarah Hunt. I believe I have critical evidence that pertains to this case." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs again, the atmosphere electric with curiosity and apprehension. Judge Gray motioned for silence, his stern gaze scanning the room before focusing on the detective. "Detective Hunt," he said, "you are not listed as a witness in this case. Can you explain your sudden appearance?" "I apologize for the intrusion," Detective Hunt replied, her voice steady. "But my investigation uncovered information directly related to Mr. Mitchell's activities. I believe this evidence could significantly impact the court's understanding of the situation." Robert's face turned an alarming shade of red. He stood again, his voice shaking with anger. "This is ridiculous. I've never met this woman in my life. She has no right to interfere in my case." Judge Gray's gavel struck the desk sharply. "Mr. Mitchell, if you interrupt these proceedings one more time, I will remove you from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Robert sank back into his chair, fuming, while his lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Detective Hunt moved closer to the bench, setting her briefcase down with a soft click as she opened it. From inside, she produced a folder and a USB drive, which she handed to the bailiff. "This," he said, gesturing to the drive, "contains financial records, emails, and surveillance footage that directly contradict Mr. Mitchell's claims. And this," she added, holding up the folder, "includes sworn statements from witnesses who can verify his actions." Judge Gray studied the detective for a long moment before nodding to the bailiff, who took the evidence to the court clerk. The room was eerily silent, everyone hanging on the detective's every word. Meanwhile, Lily stood frozen near the judge's bench, her small hands still clutching her backpack. Emily rose from her seat, her maternal instincts urging her to comfort her daughter, but a sharp look from Robert's lawyer kept her rooted in place. "Detective Hunt," the judge finally said, "before we proceed, I need to understand the relevance of this evidence. Can you summarize its contents?" Detective Hunt nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The financial records reveal significant sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts under Mr. Mitchell's name, dating back several years. The emails show communications between him and individuals who facilitated these transactions. The surveillance footage captures him meeting with these individuals late at night, despite his claims of working overtime. And the witness statements. She paused, her gaze shifting to Lily. They corroborate what this brave young girl has been trying to tell us. Lily looked up at the detective, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. Robert stood again, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This is a smear campaign. None of this proves anything. I'm being set up." Judge Gray's gavel came down harder this time, the sound echoing through the room. "Mr. Mitchell, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt. Sit down and remain silent until you are called upon." Robert slumped into his chair, muttering under his breath. His lawyer's face was pale, his hands gripping a pen tightly as he furiously jotted notes. The judge turned his attention back to Detective Hunt. "You mentioned surveillance footage. Is it ready for playback?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "It's on the USB drive." The clerk inserted the drive into a laptop connected to a screen visible to the entire courtroom. As the first video began to play, the room leaned in, breathless with anticipation. The grainy footage showed a man who was unmistakably Robert exiting a high-end car in a dimly lit parking lot. He approached another man, their faces illuminated briefly as they exchanged what appeared to be a briefcase. Gasps rippled through the audience. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting between the screen and her ex-husband. Lily flinched as Robert slammed a fist onto the table, his anger barely contained. "This proves nothing," he shouted, his voice desperate now. "That could be anyone." The judge ignored him, signaling for the clerk to continue. The footage shifted to a different location, this time inside a restaurant. Robert was seated at a private table with a woman who wasn't Emily. They appeared to be in deep conversation, their body language intimate. At one point, the woman slid an envelope across the table, which Robert quickly pocketed. Detective Hunt stepped forward again. "Your Honor, the woman in this footage is a known associate of a shell company tied to Mr. Mitchell's offshore accounts. She has also provided a statement confirming his involvement." Robert's lawyer shot to his feet, his voice shaking as he said, "Your Honor, I object. This evidence is circumstantial at best and inadmissible without proper authentication." Judge Gray held up a hand. "Your objection is noted, but given the gravity of the accusations and the preliminary review of this evidence, I'm inclined to allow it for now. You will have an opportunity to cross-examine." The lawyer sat down reluctantly, his frustration evident. Robert, however, was unraveling. He leaned forward, whispering harshly to his lawyer, but his eyes kept darting toward Lily, who was now staring at him with a mix of defiance and sadness. The judge turned to Lily again, his tone gentle. "Lily, I understand this is very difficult for you, but can you tell us what you meant earlier when you said your father was lying?" Lily hesitated, her small hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the bench. She glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then at Detective Hunt, who gave her a reassuring smile. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He said he was working late, but I saw him. He wasn't working. He was meeting those people and doing things he didn't want me to see. Her words sent another ripple through the courtroom. Judge Gray leaned forward, his expression softening. Lily, you've been very brave. Can you tell us how you know this? Lily reached into her backpack, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. I found this, she said, handing it to the bailiff. It's a list of names and numbers. I didn't understand it, but I knew it was important. The bailiff passed the paper to the judge, who examined it closely. His brows furrowed as he read, the significance of the document clear in his eyes. Before he could speak, Robert exploded, his voice loud and angry. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just a kid. She's confused. But his outburst only deepened the tension in the room, as everyone waited to see what Judge Gray would do next. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. All eyes were on Judge Gray as he studied the crumpled paper Lily had handed over. His expression darkened, a clear sign that the contents were far from innocent. The weight of the evidence against Robert was becoming undeniable, and yet the man refused to relent. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Gray said, his voice firm, these numbers appear to correlate with accounts tied to offshore transactions. Coupled with the evidence presented by Detective Hunt, this paints a troubling picture. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Robert stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He glanced at his lawyer, who shook his head subtly, signaling that silence was the best option. But Robert wasn't one to back down. His face twisted in anger and desperation as he pointed a shaking finger at Lily. She's been manipulated, he yelled. By her mother, by this so-called detective, by all of you. You don't know the pressure I'm under, the sacrifices I've made for this family. Emily flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. Lily, standing near the judge's bench, kept her ground, though her hands were shaking. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Judge Gray had to slam his gavel once again to restore order. Mr. Mitchell, the judge said, his tone sharp, your accusations are noted, but the evidence against you is extensive and corroborated. I suggest you think carefully before making further statements. For a moment, Robert faltered. His confidence, which had carried him through the trial so far, was visibly crumbling. He sank back into his seat, his face pale and his hands gripping the edge of the table. Detective Hunt stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the tension. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness who can provide additional context. This individual worked directly with Mr. Mitchell and has first-hand knowledge of his activities. The courtroom doors opened once more, and a man in his early 50s walked in. He looked nervous but determined, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. As he took the stand, he introduced himself as Greg Stanton, a former associate of Robert's. Greg's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. He spoke of secret meetings, hidden accounts, and the lengths Robert had gone to cover his tracks. He confirmed that the list of names Lily had found was a record of people involved in the scheme, each tied to transactions meant to siphon money into accounts under false pretenses. As Greg's words filled the courtroom, Robert sat frozen, his face drained of color. His lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously, but it was clear that no defense could undo the damage. Judge Gray leaned back in his chair, his expression one of grim resolution. Mr. Mitchell, he said, his voice heavy, the evidence presented here today leaves little room for doubt. You have betrayed the trust of this court, your family, and most importantly, your daughter. This court will now deliberate on the appropriate consequences for your actions. The gavel came down, signaling a brief recess. The room erupted in whispers, but Lily stayed where she was, her eyes fixed on the man she had once called her hero. Robert avoided her gaze, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. Emily rushed to Lily's side, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were so brave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so proud of you." Lily clung to her mother, her small frame shaking with a mix of relief and sadness. She had done what she had to do, but it didn't erase the pain of exposing her father's lies. When the court reconvened, Judge Gray delivered his ruling. Robert would face criminal charges for fraud and financial misconduct. Custody of Lily was granted to Emily, with a court ordering counseling to help Lily process the events she had endured. As the final gavel strike echoed through the courtroom, the weight that had been pressing on Lily's chest seemed to lift. She looked up at her mother, who gave her a reassuring smile, and then at Detective Hunt, who nodded in quiet support. Outside the courthouse, the cool breeze felt like a fresh start. Emily knelt down, taking Lily's hands in hers. "It's over now," she said softly. "We can finally move forward." Lily nodded, her lips trembling but forming the faintest smile. "I just wanted the truth to come out, Mom. I didn't want him to keep hurting us." "And you did that," Emily said, her voice firm but gentle. "You did something incredibly hard, but you showed so much courage." As they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, Lily glanced back one last time. Robert was being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. It wasn't the ending she had ever imagined, but it was one she could accept. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Emily squeezed her hand. "We've got this," she said with a smile. "One step at a time." And as they walked toward their new beginning, Lily knew her mother was right.